Dr. Janet Woodcock is the acting FDA commissioner and last year played a key role in Operation Warp Speed, the initiative to develop therapeutics in response to the pandemic. I should basically, the miraculous effort to develop therapy. Dr. Woodcock, it's great to see you again. I really appreciate it. You know, as you heard with Dr. Fauci, we're kind of reflecting on, you know, the state of where we're at right now. What have we learned? You know, I've known many of your predecessors in your role, and there always seems to be this tug of war, if you will, between the demand side of wanting new drugs and therapies and all the things that are required to help protect the public, to make sure we have good science, and to do that. And I'd just love to, you know, give you an opportunity to share with us, where is that tug of equities between public safety and delivering, particularly on COVID, but more broadly? Is the FDA where it needs to be?
Well, I would say we're in a triangle now, frankly. And on one hand is the patient need, which is as great as ever in certain areas like neurodegenerative diseases like ALS and so forth. On the other hand, the need for safety and care in you know, our oversight of pharmaceuticals and medicines in general. And then the third leg of the stool, if you will, is the cost of medicines. And the tug of war has shifted away, I think, from safety versus access, right? And shifted more into, well, we need to study these drugs more because they cost so much. We need to have a really good idea of their value. And of course, FDA isn't directly involved in the pricing of drugs. However, we're certainly impacted by that because many, as Dr. Fauci was saying, the science has advanced so far. So many of the new therapies, not just the vaccines that are making such a huge difference, but many cancer drugs, a number of drugs for rare diseases and so forth, are things we couldn't have even conceived of 30 years ago and would have been just amazed at their impact. However, we couldn't have conceived of, I think, their prices either, and that's causing a great deal of push and pull in the ecosystem.
Let me ask you, I don't know if it's an unfair question or not, but I am very interested in the role that the FDA plays here. Have talked to folks about the rollout of, you know, biosimilar drugs, you know, new pharmaceutical drugs, you know, complex molecules, and you know, the raft of things coming through is truly amazing potentially. And I'm interested in how our ecosystem differs from Europe, because the shtick is, if I may, and I may have it wrong, is that Europe somehow moves faster and quicker and gets a lot more out there. Are they taking greater risks than we are? Is our system smarter and better, or are they incomparable?
A lot is comparable. We typically approve the cutting edge novel drugs a little bit faster, right? The reason people say that about biosimilars is that we didn't have a pathway until Congress passed one, and Europe had over a 10-year start on us. And so they were getting biosimilars out there because they had a regulatory legislative pathway to get them onto the market. And so there is a lag there, although we're catching up. But people will perceive that for a long time. But bottom line, I don't think Europe and the EMA and FDA are that really different in most of our judgments or what we do, although FDA does approve some of the more cutting edge therapies more quickly.
How do you think we could, in this country, kind of, I don't know how to put it, but I mean, I'm so pro-innovation. I want to do all that. Where, you know, and I understand your role is not to look at how the, you know, the cost of the drugs looks like, but there's kind of this untalked about element, which is the business, the investment, the stock markets, the drivers of capital on one side, with essentially a lot of taxpayer-supported medical research in the national institutes and universities and research centers. And I guess, you know, I'm just wondering whether or not, when you take a step back, are all the incentives where they should be? Are they generally pretty good the way they are, even though you may see some gross things now and then in the financial markets? But I'm just sort of interested in whether or not we need to rethink some elements of this.
Well, leaving aside innovation, if I may, for a while,
Sure.
I think possibly we have too little innovation to make affordable drugs our system has too few incentives for affordable drugs such as generics. And so we're seeing all kinds of shortages and problems in older generics that are still essential medicines. So that's clearly a problem with our system. We have problems with incentives in fields that are not going to return as much on investment, such as antimicrobials. We're approaching a crisis in antimicrobial resistance, and yet we don't see robust development programs in that area because cancer, rare diseases, and certain other areas are more straightforward to develop and innovate in, and also can return on that investment. So I believe there probably are some adjustments that could be made in the ecosystem. And as you probably know, I feel that the clinical trial ecosystem definitely needs to be reformed.
Right. Well, we've been actually discussing that earlier in some of the programs about some new ways actually to create more inclusive clinical trials, reach into different parts of the country, have more diversity built in and packed in from the beginning. So completely agree. Let me ask you a question about the pathways that we had in Operation Warp Speed. Obviously, major, we can all applaud what was achieved. On the other hand, I always wonder, are there things that we didn't get right? Are there blind spots we had even in that process we should be careful of and think about? And I also know it's a global challenge. So I was very worried when the Russians came out so quickly with a vaccine that had not gone through many of the clinical trials and processes, because I thought that would collapse trust in the process in certain places. So I'm just interested in whether or not this lesson we've had is a good lesson that we should repeat, or whether or not we should be careful of repeating this because it can lead to some shortcuts that we ought not to take.
Well, I think we did very well, and I think we can do better. I think the vaccine programs were executed rather flawlessly. They really went well. They were able to execute development programs, including clinical development programs that were the size and quality of what you would see outside of a pandemic if you wanted to have a vaccine to vaccinate everybody. So that was done extremely well, I think. There were issues with inclusivity and diversity. They were addressed and corrected, but it reflects, again, our clinical trial system doesn't reach everyone, and that's a problem. With therapeutics, you may know, we have published our assessment of the enterprise-wide globally and in the US, and we found that only about 5% of trials for therapeutics that were started and registered were powered and randomized in a way that could yield actionable data. So clearly, as an enterprise, we could have done a lot better. In a pandemic or when a new disease arises, you're first going to be using repurposed drugs because you have nothing else at hand, right? And so we could have put together a much more efficient system if people hadn't run off and done all these small trials. We could have screened a lot more repurposed drugs. There's still questions and advocates out there for various drugs and trying to work through those. So I think we've learned a lot, and I think we can do better if and hopefully we won't be faced with this again.
Do you have the resources you need for the scale of things you do? And I'm not asking this to say, do you just need a bigger budget? I remember when Peggy Hamburg was there was an issue about, for instance, FDA inspectors with, global inspectors with drugs coming in from India, Southeast Asia, other places of the world, and the inspection regime. Fundamentally, your role is a big one. I don't think much of the public understands all the things that your team does, but it's a lot. And I'm just wondering whether or not you have enough to do all the things you're doing, particularly when we have a crisis like we have now.
The resources at FDA are uneven. So there are certain areas we recently announced, for example, a heavy metal in baby food initiative to try and lower the levels of toxic elements in baby food. I mean, the foods program in general is not well resourced. If we had a crisis dealing with foods, That would be, I think, problematic. We don't have much surge capacity. So this parts of the agency, such as the device center, the biologics center, particularly vaccine people and so forth, we're very stressed and continue to be very stressed by the workload. So the agency doesn't have a lot of breathing room in a crisis, and I think that is a problem. And the agency staff have tried to rise to that crisis, but you can only be in crisis mode so long.
Let me just finally ask Dr. Woodcock a completely personal question for me. I'm telling my audience, I have a needle phobia. I go get my flu shot, and I have been double vaxxed with needles. I nearly faint every time it happens. But I know that some players are out there looking at, tablets and other devices to do this. Do you have hope that we're going to be able to get beyond needles one day?
Most likely, yes. There are other ways to get things into people, or that you don't see the needle, shall we say. It shoots it in some other way. There may be oral ways of getting immunity and so forth, inhaled. I mean, technology will bring us a lot of things, and I think we're just on the verge of a real explosion in technology, as you were talking with Dr. Fauci about.
Well,
and to a comment that you asked him, I do think the National Science Foundation and other sciences need to be better funded, because what we're seeing now is a merging of biological science with other sciences like materials science, engineering, and so forth, manufacturing. And so all of these need to be bolstered, and innovations need to be brought in from the basic research. So it's an exciting time.
Let me just ask you one last question, because it was not necessarily part of the agenda, but I've, over at Bio, Michelle McMurray Heath, who was the first African-American woman running that. We had Ellen Stofan, who's the chief scientist at NASA, Franz Cordova, who was the head of the National Science Foundation until recently. I'm interested in women in science. I'm interested in inclusion in science. Is it getting better from your perspective, or do we still need to do much more focus on the fact that we're not leaving talent outside those channels there? Because I just want to recognize it's great that you're in the role you're in, but it's not, how should I say, there's still not enough, there's not equity in female leadership in our science institutions.
I agree. I mean, diversity can be a real challenge in the sciences, because we need that pipeline coming forward, and we need to support people and encourage them to go into the STEM fields. And so they can be rising up through the ranks. That we do not have the diversity both in the academic or in many of the pharmaceutical research areas, or many of the other areas where science is really important. And I think the new focus may really help with that.
Well, both of those subjects, both the funding of science that you just mentioned and also diversity, are big obsessions of mine and ours here. And I hope you'll come back and talk more about that with us, in addition to anything on COVID and all this other. Thank you, Dr. Janet Woodcock, Acting Commissioner of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.